Doing great. Welcome to the Charter School Connection podcast. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Great. So I know you're calling in from New Jersey. Hopefully, there's good weather up there. I'm not sure exactly.
Um, it's not too bad today. We're not getting any sun yet, but it's so I keep looking over because I have a window over here, but like it's we're getting a little bit of rain. Looks like it's coming in.
Yeah, and I know just from studying a little bit about your history, you've been working with schools and the school system up in New Jersey for over 15 years. Is that correct?
Well, kind of. So I spent 3 years, a bit more than that, in New Jersey. The majority of my school leadership was actually in Philadelphia.
Oh, okay.
Yes. So I spent 8 years there. I was a teacher. I was an assistant principal of instruction as well as a high school principal. And then I came over to New Jersey. I was recruited to come over here actually to turn around another district. And did that for 3 years as the executive director, where I coached principals and, instructional coaches, work with the board, et cetera.
Wow.
Yeah.
Super cool. Well, yeah, I'm really anxious to learn a little bit more about things that you've done to turn around school programs and to create and foster a good environment for learning. To start off just from square one, what got you interested? Well, I guess where are you from originally, and uh, how was your childhood, and how did you get interested in education?
Great question. So I am from the wonderful city of New Orleans originally, born and raised there, love the city. I was there the first 21 years of my life. I did undergrad there at a wonderful historically Black college by the name of Dillard University. A beautiful campus, beautiful environment. And so then when I finished my undergrad there, I moved to Atlanta for a bit, began my work in education, then went to Howard and so on. So to get the answer your question around like my childhood as it pertains to school, though the New Orleans public school system was not the best, and at this time they still have some struggles, I would say that I personally overall had a fairly positive school experience with school. I consider myself really fortunate because like my elementary school built a great foundation, as did my middle school. And then for high school, I ended up going to the first magnet school for African American children in New Orleans. Great and deep history, McDonald 35. It has since become a charter school, which has changed it. I'm not a, I mean, clearly I'm on this podcast and I've worked in charters for many years, but it's not the magnet school that it used to be. I won't say whether one is good or bad, but I would just say it's very different now than when I was growing up there. But coming up in New Orleans, I actually was very fortunate to have a lot of Black teachers. I had both male and female, and that was from K all the way through 12. And I know, I mean, highly, highly intelligent people. Every single principal I've ever had was a Black person. I had no idea how fortunate I was when I was there in those schools. It was just normal for me. It wasn't until I actually got into education that I understood, oh, wait, this is actually not the experience of most Black children in this country. There's actually a very big disparity in regards to representation and teaching and school leadership for Black children. And so I consider myself very fortunate. And then when I got to Dillard is when um so like I said, Dillard is a historically Black university, and it was in my freshman seminar class that they handed me a book titled The Miseducation of the Negroes by Carter G. Woodson. Absolutely phenomenal book. And that book was the beginning of my eyes being opened in ways that I did not necessarily anticipate. Right. And so it's when I began to realize that I was not properly and accurately educated on the history of people that look like me. And that what I felt at that time, the best way for me to articulate at that time is that my school books had lied to me. And I felt frustrated, right? Like I felt, and I mean, and this country is right now tackling this same issue right now, right? But I felt an immense amount of frustration because it's like a big part of who I am, my history. And I used to teach history, and so I have a love for history. It was just left out, right? And it was only taught from the white perspective. And I experienced a couple years of very real frustration. And so that is when I would say that my frustration with the school system began to kind of set in, and that began to be like the steps towards my current path.
That's really, really cool. And I wish I could kind of deep dive a little bit more. I guess just with one question, when did you start to realize this? I know you briefly talked about that, but when that change happened, what was kind of going through your mind? Like, were you thinking of a plan to action right away, or did you feel a little bit like helpless to change the
Yeah.
environment?
I was what, 18 years old. I wish I had the strategic ability to have a plan of action at that time, but at 18 I didn't have that. The only thing I knew how to do at 18 was learn more. And that's the journey I began. So I read more books and I gained a better understanding. I actually ended up taking additional courses in philosophy and I learned about the African diaspora, like all of those things. I just wanted to learn more because I became a seeker of truth. I would say is when that process began for me, and then I finished undergrad, moved to Atlanta, got involved in education in some small ways, and it was actually um, a life changing event that took place that really was the catalyst for me to say, okay, like I have to do something about this. And then a year later, I was enrolled at Howard University to get my master's in education administration and policy. And it's been a straight shoot up since then.
That's really impressive. So thank you so much for talking about that. And that's did you know from the get-go that you wanted to pursue like more education, like beyond a bachelor's degree?
No, I didn't. I did not. I came out of undergrad, honestly, still unsure about exactly what to do.
Hmm.
I have always loved school and I wanted to be a teacher. I remember being an undergrad and wanting to be a teacher. And I come from very humble beginnings. And there is a narrative, and this narrative obviously has some truth behind it, that teachers don't make enough money, right? And so, what I could not do at that time, coming from where I come from and trying to get to where I was going in life, I did not feel the freedom to choose a profession that wasn't going to earn me enough money.
Right.
And so I took a different, my undergrad degree is actually in business administration and policy. But I also took a ton of history courses because, like I told you, like I had this quest for learning. And so I came out of undergrad with a degree in business and a lot of history courses, and I was still lost in a lot of ways. And what happened is that I actually began to work with the youth in church.
Mm.
That's how it all started. And I began to work with the youth in church, and I was, I think, 22 years old, and I loved it. And it was just like, what, like I became alive, right? Like it just, I noticed like how it was so fulfilling for me and being able to work with small kids and that it was, I knew it was like, Nadia, what are you going to do? Right. Because you know what you want to do, but then you have to make X amount of money. And so I did that for a few years and I became the director at a tutoring center. Like I always was just involved in education. And then you kind of got me there. I wasn't going to share it, but I'll share it because you kind of get me there anyway. But I had a first cousin, amazing young man, and he we grew up together. He was maybe just about a year and a half older than myself, and we went to the same high school. Brilliant person, and he made some choices. He tried a drug that exposed a heart condition. And that led to him having some pretty severe heart problems in his 20s. He had open heart surgery when he was maybe 25 years old. It worked for about a year, but then he ended up passing away right around 27 or 28. And it was obviously a very significant loss for me and for my family. And that was the traumatic experience that I spoke to earlier. That was the thing that was the catalyst for me to say, I have to get into education. I have to do it 100%. Because my mindset then was education had become a pathway out for me. And my desire was to keep as many young Black men out of the grave early and out of prison as absolutely possible. And that was the catalyst. And that's why I enrolled at Howard. And that's my journey.
Wow. Well, yeah, I'm sorry that that happened, and I'm glad that there's some good that came out of it.
Yeah,
Uh,
definitely. Some beautiful things have come out of it.
yeah. Um, Really cool. Thank you for sharing that and the vulnerability that you have to share that. Well, it kind of leads me to a question that I think is kind of important is you kind of, for lack of better words, stiff-armed being an educator for because you of the not getting paid a lot of money, and then you eventually just knew that it was something you decided to do. And I
Mhm.
feel like that's how most educators are. No one gets into education to be a millionaire. Do
Correct.
you feel like that impacts the workforce as a whole, like knowing that these employees are not in a get rich quick scheme, but that they're there because they care about what they do?
Does it impact what exactly?
Does it impact just the workplace, the work environment?
Does it impact the workplace? I think that teachers should make more money. That's what I think. The I think the country is a bit short-sighted, and not understanding that we are all here for an identified amount of time that none of us know,
Yeah.
right? The world keeps going, life keeps going, and eventually whatever we do gets passed on to the next generation. And so when I say that a bit short-sighted is that what we pour into children, what we pour into the next generation is literally how the world is going to be in the next 50 years. And so when I say that teachers should make more money, it's because of the weight of the jobs that they have. And there was a time when the teaching profession was much more respected. Because this is a capitalist country, because teachers don't make a lot of money, they're not as the profession is just not respected like it used to be. And that's a point of frustration for me as a leader, because unfortunately, I would even say some teachers that I've worked with, they don't respect the profession
Mm.
like they used to. And so I think the bottom line of it is that teachers need to make more money. And and there needs to be much better training for school leaders and much better training for teachers. Period.
Oh, that's awesome. I agree with you 100%. My wife taught school for only 3 years, and she kind of got burnt out and didn't feel like she was getting the respect that she was hoping for. So is no longer teaching for those reasons. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. Um, so you explained how you got into education and that amazing story that you shared. And so now that you've like going back to your history, when you decided like, yes, this is what I want to do, this is what I want to pursue, could you describe kind of getting involved in education, what that was like, and then maybe a couple of your first initial experiences that kind of shaped you into who you are?
That's a great question. I would say in my initial experiences of teaching, I had the same experiences that everybody has in their first couple of years of teaching. I wasn't that good at it. Let's just be honest. Like, I got to a point where I became really great at it, but that first year was rough, right? Like, even, and it's funny because I think that, we forget that you can be called to do a certain thing. You can feel a strong, intuitive pulling towards a thing, and you still have to develop your skills, right? Like I think people forget that. And so, uh, looking back, I wasn't as bad as I felt like I was. Because I've seen, I've coached teachers anywhere in like their first year to their 20th year, right? And so I definitely wasn't as bad as it felt like I was. It just felt so overwhelming. It felt like, how in the world am I going to do this? How am I going to prepare excellent lessons every day and grade papers and hug children when they need it and meet the expectations of the leadership? Like it is hard. I would say year 3 was my turnaround year, where it was like, oh yeah, I got this. Yeah, I know what I'm doing now. And
Yeah.
I still you know, and I always like, if I could go back into the classroom now, I would get teacher of the year every single year. Like I would be, absolutely phenomenal. But year 3 was my year. It was like, okay, I know what I'm doing now. Like, and that was a really great year of teaching, and that was a big turnaround. Yeah, I like to share that because, teachers, it's hard. Teaching is hard, right? And people can often get discouraged, because again, when you feel like you're not being as successful as you would like to be in doing something, it's very easy to get discouraged. But I find that it's one of those professions where if you just stick with it and you're a reflective person, and every day, every week, every semester, you're thinking, okay, what do I want to do differently? How can I approach this differently? It comes to you. It just comes to you, and eventually you develop those skills. So that was pivotal for me. But I think the most significant thing that happened in the beginning, I wouldn't say beginning, but early stages of my career, is when I got to North Philly. So when I was teaching in DC, where Howard is, and when I got to Philly, I wanted to be an assistant principal. I was like, I am done with this graduate degree, this master's degree. I need to be in leadership, right?
Yeah.
Um, and I this one particular charter organization, phenomenal organization, Mastery Charter Schools. I give them a lot of credit because they turn around failing schools, right? And that, just having that mission to go in and do the work that really no other districts want to do, I think that's a lot of value there. They're not perfect, but no district is. But I will always give them that credit of like their mission and their values are just different than other charter organizations that I've experienced. And so when I began my work with Mastery, I taught there as well, and we were in the heart of North Philadelphia. They were turning around Mastery's first and only high school. Just the thought of it just makes me think, my God, what was I doing? So the high school that we went into, it had been, I was a part of a team. I could never in a million years take credit for all the work that was done. I was a part of a team that went into a school that had been on the persistently dangerous list for 20 years. Academic scores were in the single digits. Attendance was very, very poor, as was staff retention. And the school district of Philadelphia was actually probably going to, at that time, they were closing down a lot of high schools. But Mastery actually took Simon Gratz over. And I started there as a child, I was an 11th grade teacher. And what a year. That's how I would say that. I would say what a year. But after being a teacher, I became an assistant principal of instruction there, and I did that for several years, and I ended up becoming the high school principal. So I went through every instructional position at a high school turnaround, and I would say two things. I'm very grateful that I did it in my 20s and early 30s. I am grateful for the experience because what I learned very quickly is that being in such a difficult environment, you have to be innovative and you are forced to learn skills that truly other school leaders would don't have to learn, right? Like
Yeah.
I had to, I'm telling the learning the art of managing difficult conversations, the art of managing priorities, the art of, a really strong evaluation, but also navigating the thin line between like staff culture and accountability. Like it's just so many things that come with leadership. And when you're doing it in a turnaround environment, it's much more high stakes. And so you have to have an exceptional skill set to be successful at it because everything is urgent in a turnaround environment. And I know in education, they make everything seem urgent anyway. Like I know, like everything just seems urgent, urgent all the time. But no, this is true urgency in
Mhm.
a charter school turnaround environment. Because like the area was, very high poverty, high mental health, a lot of violence. It was quite the experience. I mean, I'm happy to answer any specific questions, but the experience was so wide and so just like complicated. It's hard for me to focus on one thing without a specific question.
Yeah, no, I'm sure. And I love how you talked about urgency. It's just funny when everything is important, like nothing's important. When
Yes,
everything's urgent, like nothing's urgent. So,
and I
but
say,
so when you got to this point as the leader of this high school, um, you mentioned some of the challenges, with attendance, etc. Um, what for schools that are also struggling with these same issues, what would you like say that you learned, and how did you overcome these challenges? What would you recommend to other schools from your past experience?
Yeah, it all starts with the data. Do a true like deep dive into the data. And so when I'm thinking about attendance, what I want to know is not only what the general attendance numbers are. Let's say if your attendance is at 80%, it needs to be at 90%, 95%. You want to go deeper into that. So break down your attendance by grade, break it down by gender, break it down by race, break it down by socioeconomic status, by whether students receive specialized services. Like get all the data because what you'll find is if there is a group of individuals that are struggling with attendance for a very specific reason, then you know what problem to solve, right? If you never know that your biggest attendance challenge is excuse me, I should say that differently. The students that struggle with attendance most are your students that have, a certain socioeconomic status. Well, it could be a transportation issue, right?
Mhm.
It could be, and that's solvable. But if you don't break down, right, that's a totally solvable problem. But if you don't break down the data in that way, you'll never know which problem to solve. So
Mhm.
don't be afraid to go very deep into the data so you can break down the problem. And then, so that's, and I always say stuff like that because if you talk to most school leaders right now, they will say they know the data and they look at the data. Do you look at the data to that depth of what I just said? Do you look at the data on a regular basis? Or is it just that your attendance coordinator sends you an email every morning that says this was attendance today? That's not the same thing, right? So actually set aside time to go deep into the data to try to fix that. And then you got to have some conversations with students and with parents. And there are even school leaders that don't feel a level of comfort doing that. Seek to understand why is, child A only coming to school 3 days a week or 4 days a week. Why is this happening? Is there something going on at home that we can help with? Like, have those conversations with parents. And oftentimes, like, it can also be the teacher that's causing that child to not want to go to school, to not want to come to school, right? If a child constantly feels unsuccessful in school, who wants to go somewhere where they always feel unsuccessful? Like, come on, nobody. I think that we forget, and I have experienced this multiple times where the adults that I'm working with forget, they just have this mindset of young people should just do what they're supposed to do just because they're told to do it. And they forget that they're working with human beings, and that even you as an adult, like I just said, don't want to go somewhere every day where you don't feel successful. So then why would you expect this human being, this child that might be 16, 17 years old, if they're constantly being told that they're not smart enough, or their grades are not good enough, they're misbehaving, if it's all a negative space when they walk in, I'd stop coming to school too. Like, nobody needs that in their life every day. And so after you do those the data, the supportive aspects, and then there's the accountability. Like, at the end of the day, you know, holding the child, the parents, etc., the teacher, everybody has a measure of accountability in that. Holding people accountable to what needs to be done, which is you need to come to school.
Yeah. Okay. Wow. That's a really good recommendation to make sure you diagnose the problem correctly. Um, awesome. Now, what I'm really interested in knowing is, so I know that you were a part of it, education, charter schools for a while, but I know since you've started multiple organizations, I was wondering if you could explain a little bit what you do now currently.
Yes, I would love to. So I am the founder and CEO of When Brown Girls Lead. It is an education consulting firm that supports schools in leadership development as well as creating anti-racist school environments. And so our leadership development, now I want to be very clear, because the name of the company, When Brown Girls Lead, and because I do anti-racism, people sometimes think that I only work with Black leaders or Black women. I have a particular passion for Black women because I know the data behind our leadership and I know the disparities there. However, I work with any leader that is aligned with the mission and the vision of my company, right? If you truly want to create an anti-racist school environment, if you want to be an ally in that work, even though you're a different gender, a different race, et cetera, it does not matter. My desire is to, like I said, work with anyone that wants me to walk alongside them, and vice versa, in seeing that mission through. So I desire to create psychologically safe and brave spaces for K-12 leaders, and that's every K-12 leader. And I do that through one-on-one coaching, in that, I am working with one leader either for an 8-week intensive or a full school year. And we're working on all the things that they need to work on. Like I said earlier, priorities, art of a difficult conversation, building their instructional eye, working with parents, managing up, managing subordinates, et cetera, whatever that individual needs. And I also do professional training and development for whole leadership teams. I'm coming off of a very busy summer where I was traveling a lot, supporting leadership teams nationally, in building their awareness as leaders and building their skill set as leaders. And then my other key service is anti-racist school environment. So that could look like me going into a school or district and doing a comprehensive needs assessment on where they are as far as anti-racism. That includes me observing classrooms, talking to students, talking to parents, teachers, leaders, et cetera, doing a full assessment of where the school is, and then providing some strengths and opportunities for that school. And then I also coach leaders and I do professional development for the staff. And again, that's a relationship, that's a long-term relationship in turning around some of the disparities that we see in the numbers.
The disparities that you mentioned, are they hopefully getting better as the years go by, or are we at a plateau, or what's the trend right now? Because I'm not very informed.
Yes. So in schools, what I would say the trend, so the key numbers that individuals that do this work, building anti-racist schools to do this work, the key numbers that they're typically looking at is suspension rates, Black children are nationally, they're suspended at a much higher rate than their white peers. And oftentimes they're suspended for things that are subjective, such as disrespect. Disrespect can be defined differently depending upon who you're talking to. What I find is that a lot of that is cultural differences, which we can talk about in the second part of this. They also look at AP and honors, because what you find is that there's an overrepresentation of white and Asian students in AP and honors, but then there's an overrepresentation of Black students in specialized services. So the question is, like, are we even giving Black children the opportunity to be a part of honors and AP classes, right? And are they being properly assessed when someone decides that they need an IEP? So are those numbers the overrepresentation of Black students in specialized services, the underrepresentation of Black students in AP and honors, and the overrepresentation of students in suspensions? How can I say this? Have they gotten better nationally? There's been small improvement, like small percentages. It's like creeping down, but it's not nearly as good as what it needs to be.
Yeah, that's really interesting that you brought that up, because I think you maybe opened my eyes a little bit. I was in special education until third grade. I actually had the only Black teacher I've ever had was my like parapro. She like sat next to me, and she was Mrs. Stevens, anyways.
Mhm.
And the special education classes that I was in, it was mostly Hispanic and Black with me, but I actually tested out and got put into like a advanced class. But obviously, me being the only white guy, I wonder like how much that played into that, because I didn't see my other counterparts get that opportunity to test and move up. And um, so yeah, I think I might have been on the better side of maybe some of that discrimination that we see.
Or it's because someone looked at you as a white boy and said, well, he shouldn't be here. And like, whether we want to
Uh,
accept that or not, as a white child, a decision maker, looked at you and said he shouldn't be here. So they made decisions to make sure that you were no longer there. However,
uh,
when you look at Black and Latinx children, they do belong there. So they don't even try to create the change and make the decisions to get them to a different place.
that makes me cringe to know some of the truthfulness behind that. And so I'm really grateful for people like you that advocate for change and advocate for. I mean, it's hard to try to fight, unconscious biases, and so
Same with that's why I mentioned with AP and honors, where so with AP and honors, there's typically 3 to 4 criteria for a child to get into AP honors. Obviously, their grades, their test scores, but teacher opinion is typically in every school is a part of that criteria, because teachers are supposed to be the one to say, oh yes, this child will work hard once in AP. This child will work hard once in honors, because as we all know, a person can be very smart naturally, but not want to work for it. Right. So
mhm.
they might have good grades and might do well on tests, but that's not because they're working hard. It's just because they're very smart. So those are the young people who oftentimes like maybe won't be as successful in AP because they're not going to put in the work even though the work is going to get more challenging. So if you think about, as you just mentioned, the implicit bias that we all come into spaces with, and if you're in an environment where the majority of teachers are white, and they get to have a decision about if a Black child should qualify or be placed into honors or AP, it is highly unlikely they're even going to think about the Black child when it comes to honors and AP, because we all bring our biases into a space. And society, the school system, the prison system, all these systems that are built on institutionalized racism in America, they have taught us that Black children are intellectually inferior. which is a complete lie. This myth has been dispelled in tons and tons of research, right? They've taught us that they're intellectually inferior, so it doesn't even, but if a person is not conscious, if they're not aware of that natural bias that's going to come up, they're just going to do, and it won't feel like they're doing anything wrong. This is why this is why I find like a lot of the people that I work with, school leaders that identify as white, they struggle with implicit bias and struggle with the fact that they may be perpetuating institutionalized racism, because what they'll say is that, well, I don't, like, they're not looking at Black children calling them the N word, right? They're not looking at Black children saying, oh, this child is not smart. They're like, what? Like, I'm not racist. What are you talking about? Like, it's an offense that comes. Ibram Kendi said, it is not enough to not be racist. One must be anti-racist. And so, in being anti-racist, it means that you are intentional about speaking up against and making decisions that go against racist policies. So let's take our eyes off of whether an individual is racist and put our eyes on there are systems that have been created with the foundation of institutionalized racism. And as long as we, as the people now leading those systems, do not become aware of the implicit bias that is subconscious that we all have, we will perpetuate those systems. And so people don't understand what it has done to their brains to see, like, us use media for an example. When you see a Black person on TV, probably maybe up until the last maybe 5 years, maybe 5. Growing up, though, whenever you saw a Black person on TV, they were poor, they were violent, they did not speak well, they were enslaved. Did I name anything positive? And if you know, you're an educator, so you understand how the brain works. You understand that the brain is very malleable between the ages of birth and about 7 years old, like a sponge. It just soaks up everything, everything, everything. And then something happens around 7 or 8 years old where things are locked into the subconscious. And now, if between birth and 7 years old, the only experience that you had with Black people are those 4 things that I've named, you tell me what you think about Black people when you're 15.
Yeah, it's an uphill battle to look at them without that bias.
Yeah.
So
It's, you know, and so people have to be intentional about building their racial consciousness and take responsibility for undoing the things that we have been taught.
yeah, man, that's so powerful. Um, yeah, there's definitely that self-betrayal that you mentioned, you
Mm.
know, of people, every day. No one wakes up thinking that they're a bad person. No one wakes up thinking that they're racist or what they're doing is harmful. And so trying to find ways to uh to work past that self-betrayal that a lot of people have. So I guess if yeah, I really feel like we should break this into 2 parts and we should meet another time, because it's so interesting. But I guess to start to close things a little bit, I was wondering if you could expand on, like, if you had like a magic wand and you could change policy, you could change systems, you name it, like, what would be maybe 1 or 2 things where, if Nadia had the magic wand to change the world, like what are some things you could skip all the bureaucracy and just change?
That is a great question. Nobody's ever asked me that. That's a great question. I think that if I had a magic wand, I would want the absolute most talented, most intelligent, most technologically astute individuals in this country to develop an extensive program that changes the brain in regards to racism. I know I probably went to like a crazy place, but like that changes that changes the brain in regards to racism, and
Mhm.
that everybody in this country have to go through that program. Like
Yeah, I like that.
that would be my magic wand. Like it doesn't matter like age, race, gender, how long you've been in this country, none of it matters. Everybody has to go there. That
Yeah,
would that would be
yeah. That
that
we
would
would,
be pretty cool.
yeah, you would just change it from the source, you
Yeah,
know?
let's just change from so let's just start all over. And then we'll because that would be the fastest way to
Mhm.
undo the hundreds of years of like racism that we're trying to undo right now. That the fastest way to get people to unlearn, building your racial consciousness, a lot of it is unlearning what we've been taught and learning something different. That's how I would get everybody to unlearn.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Two more questions if you don't mind.
Mhm.
Um, uh, so question would be, for charter school administrators, teachers listening to this podcast, you said that you work with people one on one. And I'm sure that you give, unique and customized advice depending on the individual. But just from your experience, like what are some very common recommendations that you make to people? What are some, like, a couple easy things that people can do in their lives to either check and make sure if they have any type of policy that enables racism, or like how can people change now?
Yeah. Also a great question. I'm gonna always start with the data, right?
Yep.
Gotta go to the data. Like that is it is doable, it's manageable, and anybody can do it. Go look at your behavior data and your academic data, break it down by race and by gender, socioeconomic status as well. And you're looking for the comparing the suspension rates, right? And because you want to know if Black children are suspended at a higher rate than their white and Asian peers. I would say Black and Latinx children, if they're suspended at a higher rate than their white and Asian peers. And then you want to go deeper into that and understand why. Why are they being suspended? Like, for example, there was some national numbers that came out. This might have been 10 years ago now, but it hasn't changed much. But that the number one reason that a Black child was suspended, and these were high school numbers, was for disrespect. And the number one reason a white child was suspended was for smoking cigarettes. Smoking cigarettes under 18 is illegal, right? And so white children literally had to do something illegal to be suspended. A Black child just has to do something that is disrespectful in a white adult's eyes, right? When nobody, so look at why the children are being suspended, because what I never want to, imply is that the standard should be the same for everybody, is what I'm trying to say. And that there are some things that are just cut and dry. In that if it's violence, if it's something that causes harm to the child or another child, yes, and everybody should be suspended, right? Like there's no
Yeah.
black, white, or indifferent. They should be suspended. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying get into the data and understand that the reason that the Black and Latinx children is based upon somebody's perspective of them. It's not real, right? And so that's where that implicit bias is coming in. That's where that perception of a child is coming in. It's an adult's perception oftentimes. It's not something that the child is actually doing. So getting into that data, then when you get to your academic data, you want to know if the course passing rates of Black children, Black and Latinx children versus their white and Asian peers, are like, what are they comparing those? And then the AP and honors, which I spoke about earlier, like the access to AP and honors. Those are a few numbers that you can look at very easily to see kind of where your district is. You can also look at staff diversity numbers, right? So if 15% of your student body identifies as Black, then 15% of your teaching and leadership staff should also identify as Black. Like that's the minimum. That's not even right. Like that's just the obvious, right? But that obvious is not happening, you know. So look at all the data, and then when disparities are identified, ask yourself why. Why do these disparities exist? And that's oftentimes where an outside party needs to come in, because it's very easy to stay on surface and say, oh, well, this exists because, in sixth grade this year, we had a high number of students that receive specialized services and they have impulsive behaviors. That could be it. Right. But if we look a little bit closer, we might find, because it's easy to rationalize things away, but an outside party will allow you to get rid of all that context and not rationalize it away, but actually look into the numbers. And then we go through a process of the adults taking responsibility, right? The adults got to take responsibility. I always say that anti-racist schools begin with anti-racist adults. Mm. Right. And so the adults have to take responsibility and have to do their work. So those are three quick things.
Man, awesome. Thank you so much. You mentioned like the higher suspension rate, and I was just curious, from what you've seen, does the higher, like for a Black child, let's say hypothetically gets suspended, have you found that they're fairly resilient to say like, no, that's not true, I'm not that the type of kid to get suspended? Or does it affect them neurologically? Do they feel like, hey, maybe I am a bad kid because I am getting suspended this much? Does it affect them, or do?
That's also a great question. I am beginning to see more children that will say, no, this is not me, I should not be suspended. It is because they're now being raised by parents that are teaching their children that it's okay to advocate for yourself. Every generation before this, we were not allowed as children, and particularly as Black children, to advocate for ourselves. The teacher was right. Like that was just, and I don't think that that's just the Black community. I think in education in general, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 50 years ago, people just had like the teacher was right. That this is when the profession was respected, right? And so going back to what we said earlier, but now where we have a generation of children where parents are saying, no, you don't just accept what the adult says, and parents are advocating for their children more, and they're teaching their children to do that. So now we're seeing some of that, but I wouldn't even say that that's the majority. For the most part, children are still just accepting, because adults have a power. Just because you're bigger and you're taller and you're smarter, and children for the most part are taught to respect adults, you come into the space with a power. And so when you have that power, like most children will just say, okay. And you're right, then it begins to impact them neurologically. And then you have the whole idea of like school to prison pipeline, self-fulfilling prophecy, like that whole stuff, all those things come into play.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we'll definitely have to turn this into two parts. My last question for you, if you don't mind, ma'am, is what's one thing that has made you who you are? Maybe like a podcast or a book you read, or I don't know, a church sermon. Like it could be anything. What's one thing that like you've taken and that's like had an impact on your life, and you could maybe recommend a book to listeners, or I don't know, just anything?
That is a great question. Something I think I would have to do it separately. I can definitely recommend some books. But I would say the thing that has made me who I am are all of the amazing Black women that I had around me. Starting with my mother, who is one of the strongest, most hardworking, most business savvy, socially astute. Like she is just nothing to play with, like her. And I have two godmothers that are a significant part, and aunt that played a significant part in my life, and a youth director at church by the name of Miss Ada Green, who she was the one that had me reciting Langston Hughes poems in church at 8 years old, right? Like I tell people all the time, like I came into this world who I am. And there were people along the way that cultivated and built those skills. And a lot of the women, I had an amazing group of women as an example for me. And so I'm very grateful and fortunate for that. And then, just me being a good old fashioned nerd, I think that and that like I just love to read, and I'm a seeker of knowledge. And so that just came naturally. So that would be the answer to that question. I would say some books that I could recommend that have made a significant difference. White Fragility is a
Okay.
phenomenal book. Author's last name is D'Angelo. Um, Another book is Multiplication is for White People. It dispels a lot of myths, and it talks about, yeah, your facial expression is hilarious.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. Like, I'm interested now.
yeah, it's a great book. I used to use that one all the time in PLCs when I was a principal, but phenomenal book. Um, while the Black kids sitting together at the cafeteria. That one is very scholarly, but if you have like the brain and the desire, you can go for that one. And then some of the more recent ones, How to Be Anti-Racist, which I mentioned earlier. But for schools in particular, oh, and Push Out, I'm looking back at my bookshelf now. Push Out by Maurice Moore. So, okay, let me break it down. For educators, Multiplication is for White People, and Push Out. Those are written specifically for schools and school leaders, and talks about institutionalized racism in schools. I would also add to that Getting into Good Trouble at School. That's a more recent one. So those are my three for educators. In general, if you want to build your racial consciousness and just be better in this area in general, then I would go to White Fragility and How to Be Anti-Racist.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much for those recommendations. I'll make sure to add the tags to the podcast so that listeners can have quick links to those books.
Absolutely.
Man, well, I really appreciate your time. Before we wrap up, is there, I don't know, just anything that you feel like you wanted to talk about and I never really hit on, or?
I think you hit on a lot of things, but I would just leave with a word of encouragement to anyone that is feeling an intuitive urge towards this work of anti-racism, diversity, inclusion, and understanding. I would say follow that urge, follow that pulling towards it, and do it without fear. And even if you feel fear, do it anyway. Yeah.
I don't want to add anything to that. That was perfect. Thank you so much, Nadia.
You're very welcome. This was a great conversation.
It was a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for your time and for your expertise. Hope listeners check out your organization. It's again How Brown Girls Lead.
They can find me at Nadia Bennett /podcast. And if
Okay.
they go there, they can sign up for a free resource on anti-racism or school leadership. And they can keep in touch with me through that. And then on Instagram is at When Brown Girls Lead. And my website is NadiaBennett.com.
Okay, NadiaBennett.com, When Brown Girls Lead. Great. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time, and hopefully we'll stay in touch. All right. Bye, Nadia.